Two separate planes have hit the World Trade Centers. We do have firefighters on the scene.
The FBI is looking into the possibility of a plane hijacking.
In Pentagon City, Defense Department employees hoping that there are no more planes heading this way.
There was no doubt about it. Whoever was piloting that plane was aiming for the Pentagon.
You see people that are jumping from the top of the building.
I want you to take a look at what's happening right now.
World Trade Center 2 has just collapsed.
That's the second of the towers to collapse.
You can see a massive plume of smoke. People are running away from the area. Let's get out of here, Ralph.
The building began to come down, and it began to look like a scene out of Independence Day.
John Meyer is near that crash site.
There is a 45-foot crater in the ground.
Down from the New York Stock Exchange, Bob.
A total scene of carnage here.
Traveling with the President of the United States, who was running with no place to hide.
They're gone. Look at that. History. They're gone. The World Trade Center is no more.
So it was 8:45 and I was watching Good Morning America, and Charlie Gibson was interviewing Fergie, and all of a sudden my TV set flickered, and my first thought was, oh, they must be having trouble with the signal down at the Trade Center.
We're supposed to be right under the World Trade Center to cover the voting machines. It was primary day in New York.
So I flipped over to the Channel 4, the NBC affiliate.
So we went to City Hall.
And I just could not believe my eyes.
We heard whoosh. I said, what the hell is that?
There was this huge gaping hole in the North Tower with smoke pouring out of it, and the anchors were saying that there was a plane inside the building.
We're in commercials now. We ran down the block, ran down Park Row.
So I immediately called my bosses down in Washington.
Dave, with his camera and his cable, came down, because we're a live show, came down, and we looked up, and I said, that's either an explosion from inside or something hit from outside.
And I said, do you guys see this? And they said, yeah, go live and then get down there.
We finally got live. I yelled to the producer, please come to me, please come to me. Beth McCauley was the producer. Come to me, come to me. We've got a major story.
Like so many other New York journalists, I was at home. We were all sleeping in, doing things at home, waiting for the New York mayoral primaries to get underway. We're all going to be working late that night. So I was at home with my son, and we turned on the TV like I always do to catch up on the news, and obviously saw what was happening and immediately called my newsroom. I kissed my son goodbye and ran towards the scene, like you do when you're a journalist. You run to where the news was happening.
It was such an ordinary day. It was so perfectly innocent, standing in a second-grade classroom, rows and rows of little 6-year-olds running through their reading drills.
Well, I was having breakfast at the Regency Hotel, which is on 61st and Park.
The president came in and sat down,
discussing the state of affairs in the financial markets that day.
But all of a sudden, the president's White House chief of staff came over, leant down, and whispered into his ear.
A gentleman at the next table said, have you heard that 2 planes hit the Trade Center?
Nobody interrupts the president. Nobody interrupts him. Not even in a second-grade classroom. I was so stunned.
And I said, come on, you're joking. And he said, no, I'm very serious.
And at that moment, anything that was normal was shattered by the look on President Bush's face.
I got into a cab. I called CNBC's assignment desk and asked what we were doing. And they said, well, we've got crews down on the west side of the towers, get down there.
I made my way over to the side of the classroom to catch the eye of the White House Chief of Staff, and with my hand I made a sign of an airplane. He nodded and put up 2 fingers.
I was in the newsroom that morning. I'd been already working on what I thought was going to be my assignment for the day, which was reporting on Michael Jordan deciding to come back to play for the Washington Wizards. We were watching TV. Somebody cut in, and all of a sudden we saw pictures of the World Trade Center burning. The FAA had just shut down all flights to New York, so we knew that flights were going to be affecting Washington, D.C. So I headed over to Reagan National Airport.
We were sitting in our post-show meeting, and I was looking at one of the producers, and I noticed him looking over his shoulder at one of the monitors. And in the newsroom, obviously, there's a lot of monitors at the top of the newsroom. And I turned around to look at what he was looking at, and noticed that there was an image of the World Trade Center on fire. And at first I thought it was images from the bombing, and I thought, why are they showing that? And then I realized that it was live because I saw the live bug, and I turned around to my photographer Chet and said, we're out of here.
We launched the helicopter, we went across the city. They were telling us that it was a Cessna that hit the building. I've been a pilot since 1976, so I've been flying since '76, and there's no way a Cessna would make that much of a hole in a building like that.
there's actually a young lady in the aircraft who's kind of in training for Chet, and it's kind of a strange day to be in training, but it ended up happening that way. So I'm kind of trying to fly the aircraft, looking for traffic, and direct her of what she needs to do. And in the monitor I saw, what I saw was an explosion, what I thought was a secondary explosion, and what ended up happening after viewing the tapes later, that it was actually the second plane hitting.
I didn't even know at that time that a second plane had hit, because we were in the helicopter, there was no broadcast signal, there was only cable signals at that point, and it was very hard for us to get any kind of information.
The big story of September 11th, up until about 8:30 in the morning, was that Michael Jordan might be playing for the Wizards. So I was at MCI Center until my news director called and said, get to the White House. A couple of planes have hit the World Trade Center. The president's on his way back to give a statement.
I was coming down the West Side Highway at 8:45 a.m. and all of a sudden the driver of the car slammed on the brakes and said, look, look, what is this? Look, look. And I looked up and there was an immense fireball coming out of the North Tower. And I called the office, I got into the studio and said, I don't know what's going on. Get a camera on the North Tower. There's a fireball coming out of it. And my producer said, well, what happened? I said, I don't know. The building is on fire. Just get a camera on it.
I got into the office about 8 o'clock. And a young lady that I know stopped by my office and told me that an aircraft had hit the World Trade Center building. My first thoughts were it was a traffic plane or a helicopter.
And I got out of the car and I ran to the first person who was standing on the corner and I said, what happened? And the guy was standing there like this, literally with his mouth open, and he didn't even turn and look at me. He just said, I just saw a plane go into the building. And I called the producer in the studio, and he said, well, was it a big plane? I said, I don't know anything else. That's it. I'm going towards the building.
I was stuck in typical Washington, D.C. morning commute. I was listening to the radio, I was listening to NPR, and I kept hearing the accounts from New York. And all I wanted to do was get into the office, A, to see what was going on, to get the visual, and then B, I wanted a part of the story.
When I saw the first plane hit, I thought that it was a Cessna.
And then, all of a sudden, the second plane hit. We were still on the air, and the conclusion was there. Terrorism. Had to be. Had to be.
In 1993, I had covered the World Trade Center bombing. And it was a target once, and it was a target again.
And hundreds of people had come out of the buildings. It was like we were watching a Mets game or something. Everyone was looking at the building as the fireball hit, and the sound was deafening. And the one thing I really remember is the sound of everybody gasping. Everybody went at once. About 20 seconds later, the debris started coming towards us, and everyone just turned and ran like I have never seen anyone run. I've never seen mass panic. I wanted to get on the air to describe what was happening, and the cell phones were dead. And I just ran to the stock exchange. It was in the next block.
You start to have weird thoughts. How are they going to put a fire out that's 1,000 feet up in the air?
We saw something kind of almost dripping off the buildings, and it took us a while to realize what it was.
Watched debris start to come off. We thought it was debris until we watched it hit the deck.
It wasn't debris that we saw falling out of the buildings. It was people.
It was overwhelming. We pulled back and tried not to show anything too close.
We made our way through the police barriers, and we were showing our press IDs. And as we were walking towards the South Tower, and we were probably a block away, we were looking up, and smoke started to pour out of the building, and things started to fall. And I ran around the corner, and there was a car parked perpendicular to a building. And I ran around the side of the car and plopped down next to it, and in no time it was pitch black.
There was going to be no speech on education at that moment. The president said the words that we had been dreading.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Whenever you travel with the president, you have to be prepared for anything. Anything can happen. You're always prepared for the worst. But the idea of a plane crash in New York, the civilians, the citizens, the innocent bystanders that must have been hurt, the whole idea of the casualties was just overwhelming. I didn't really think of the president being a target or at risk. We did race from the school. We jumped in the motorcade, made our way a few minutes to the Sarasota airport. The president was rushed aboard Air Force One very, very quickly. The door slammed shut. And those of us who had been cleared and already checked to get on board the plane were told to drop our gear, open everything, open the computers, open our camera bags. And while Secret Service agents stood over yelling at us, move it, move it, move it, get on the plane, the bomb squad was going through everything we owned, checking everything once, twice, to make sure that anything that got on the president's plane was okay. I finally just scooped everything up, bags open, computer still on, grabbed it in my arms and ran on board the plane. We had no idea as we sat down that at just a moment earlier, the Pentagon had been hit.
I monitor the police and fire frequencies in Washington, D.C. That's where I get most of my leads for the news that I shoot.
Okay, right now we have an airplane that crashed into the Pentagon. It's heliport side. It'd be the heliport side of the Pentagon.
So I knew that was just too much of a coincidence. What had happened in New York, that was it for me. I had to get up and go. My car is equipped with more radios, more communication devices. The trunk is full of my photographic equipment. I'm always ready. I never know. I shoot spot news. I can get up in the middle of the night and go. I'm ready to go when I get there.
I ran to the White House as fast as I could, and I got there in time to see floods, just billows of people just pouring out of the White House, and the Secret Service screaming, run, run, do not walk, run away from, get away from the building.
All right, that's Amy Morris at the White House. Amy, can you describe for us what the scene looks like? Is there chaos out there?
You know, it's sort of an organized chaos. I mean, they're keeping everybody really calm. A lot of people have had the presence of mind to whip out the old video.
And I showed my press credentials, and I said, but you don't mean me. And they meant everybody.
As soon as I got to the airport, I remember looking up and seeing smoke over the trees in the direction of the Pentagon. I went over and talked with a airport police officer who was standing there looking at the smoke, and I said to him, what happened? And he said, my radio just said a plane went into the Pentagon.
And we saw this inky black acrid smoke over the Potomac, and this beautifully unnaturally blue sky just molested by all of this smoke. And this construction worker standing next to me said, that's the Pentagon. And your brain doesn't know quite how to take that.
I'm here with a familiar face, Mike Walder of USA Today. Mike, you actually saw this happen. Tell us what you saw.
I looked up, I saw the jet, and it did this kind of lazy bank and banked in front of me.
Over here, it clipped this pole over here, hit another pole and slammed right into the building. Huge explosion, and then utter pandemonium, as you might imagine. I mean, everybody was screaming, oh my God.
This fireball, huge column of smoke, and I sat there in total disbelief. And it was like time stood still. You watched this jet, and you knew what was going to happen, and you had there was nothing you could do. All I remember is just shaking my head and saying, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And you kept seeing people and this look of terror in the eyes of everyone around you. America was under attack. I thought to myself, I've got two options. I'm very close to work. I can go into work. I can get a photographer, and I could come back here. And then I thought better of that. I said to myself, there's no way I'm going to get any closer than I am right now. I got to get out of the car, and I got to try and get a hold of work and have them send a photographer.
Everything about myself just shut down, and I had to bring up the reporter and just focus on what was happening, or I wouldn't have been able to do anything. I wouldn't have been able to function.
I wasn't afraid for a while until we heard, I guess, about what was going on in Washington, and at that time I began to get nervous because I realized that it was an aerial attack, that there were several things going on, and here we were in the air.
They had actually given me my code, which is my aircraft number, which is 311, because what they were trying to do was identify each aircraft that was still up.
Basically, I just focused on the day, and my pilot, I mean, I must have asked him 4,000 times, Ray, they know we're here, right? They know we're here. They know who we are. They know we're the good guys.
Every single time I had to go for fuel, I fueled 2 or 3 times that day. I just kept that code and made sure that whoever the authority was that I was talking to at that moment, they knew who I was, what the code was, and when I was coming back out.
In the beginning, we were fairly close, and you could see NYPD the helicopters were around. It was, I mean, there was fire engine apparatus coming from everywhere.
it was amazing. I mean, just this massive humanity was going towards the World Trade Center. I was a firefighter for a bunch of years, so I actually trained with a couple of the guys that were in there, and it was just, you do what you have to do. I mean, that's your job. Looking at the building, I'm looking through the building, and I told Linda, you know, being on rescue for a bunch of years and fire, the building just, it looks like it's not going to stand up. She got real upset with me, and obviously, well, we knew what happened.
There was one moment during the day where I was standing at a payphone, and I was waiting to go live, and I was on hold, and all of a sudden, people started screaming, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." And I peer around the payphone, and I'll never forget it. And the South Tower is collapsing in slow motion. And the man standing next to me said, "Part of America is gone forever."
My editor jumped in the middle of one of my live reports and said, "Amy, we lost a tower." I almost started to freak out a little bit. I almost lost that focus. And when I started to panic, she said to me, "A lot of people died today, but a lot of people are still alive, and we have to tell them what to do. You have to help us tell them what to do. Just stay focused on that."
I have covered the White House through 6 presidents, through wars, through assassination attempts, through times of the Cold War, through times when there was always the danger of some major nuclear catastrophe. And I've always known there's a doomsday scenario. There's a book, what the military does, what the White House does, how a president's evacuated, how he's kept secure, how the chain of command of the U.S. government is absolutely sacred. I had no idea that someday I would be sitting on Air Force One watching that doomsday scenario play out.
Both my pilot and my photographer had a lot of experience in the military. They were using our camera to help identify aircraft in the air.
I'm thinking if I make any erratic movements or I make any movements that they don't have me identified, they're going to shoot me down.
And it was getting very difficult to breathe because the air really was filled with this stuff. And it was pitch black, and I reached up to see if the back door of this car was open, and it happened to be. And I crawled inside the car and just sat there for a while and tried to figure out what I was going to do. Thought about calling my wife. I dialed the home number and then thought, you know, if they're going to find me here in a couple of days, I'd best not go down that route.
I didn't have time to think. I didn't know where to go. People were asking me because they saw that I had the AP mic flag in my hand.
The thing about what happened in D.C. was that there was no screaming, there was no running, there was no mass hysteria. There was confusion, a lot of frustration, some fear. But from my point of view as a reporter that day, remember, I didn't know about that 4th plane. I didn't know about United Airlines Flight 93, headed for the White House. So all I had to do was just focus on what had happened. I had no idea something could be about to happen. So I didn't know enough to be scared.
You know, I'm 75 yards away from the point of impact and looking down and hear small pieces of the plane's wreckage that had been sprayed back that far, about the size of my shoe. And it just hits you, you know. If a jet is eviscerated like that, the people inside that jet and the people inside the Pentagon, what are they reduced to?
We got to the end of Broadway, and as just before we hit Broadway, I heard this giant clang.
I guess they both came down while we were trying to figure out where we were. My camera guy, I thought, had died because I didn't know. I had no idea where he was. He had no idea where I was. We both assumed the other person was dead.
Did you think you were going to die?
I thought for a period when I was inside the car that I was just going to be buried in whatever was piling up around me.
When I was about, I would say, 8 or 10 blocks away from the towers, that's when the first one came down, and the sight in front of your eyes, you believe isn't really happening. You just can't process that. And when that happened, I immediately tried to get to a phone, call into my station, find out where everyone is, where should I be going, tell them what I've just seen, report into the newsroom, call it in, go on the air.
As the day progressed and I realized that if I hung up my cell phone, I'd never get back to the station again. I just had to stay on hold, terminal hold with my radio station, and whenever they'd need me, they'd just pick me up. The other cell phone I had in my hand, I'm frantically trying to call my family, my husband, my folks, my brothers, And of course, you're not getting a signal out.
Thankfully, in our newsroom, we have these two-way pagers where you're able to communicate with the entire newsroom just by typing in a few words. I remember typing in unconfirmed report, another plane heading this way.
I kept looking up in the sky and I thought to myself, is this what this day is all about? I'm going to keep looking up in the sky and it's going to be raining jets all around me?
I was beginning to lose my signal on the cell phone. So I ran down Park Row towards Broadway and Vesey Street. A big, burly cop said, "Where you going?" I said, "I'm going to the World Trade Center." I showed him my press passes, though, that were going to get me there. He said, "You, get out of here."
When I got off that payphone and they didn't know where the reporter was, that's when I said, okay, well, I'm going to assume I'm not going to find him. I'm going to start doing the interviews on my own. You know, at that point, I don't have a TV camera. I don't have a microphone. I don't have anything that you do for TV news with me. I had my reporter's notebook and a pen.
In each cabin on Air Force One, there's a television set recessed into the front bulkhead wall. And the engineer, the navigator on board, had been able to pull up a very faint signal from ground television stations. So while we couldn't hear anything, we were watching these fuzzy pictures of buildings on fire and people running for their lives. And the pictures of a building collapsing, taking with it, at that point, we could only imagine thousands of lives.
We were up when both towers collapsed, and we were very close. I mean, literally, I've seen all the images on television, but to watch them with the naked eye right outside your window, it was like something beyond words.
When the building bowed just before it collapsed was the most unbelievable thing that I'd ever seen. It literally squatted and bowed out like a bow, and it just bowed, and then it just fell upon itself. And I can't, you know, that's one thing I'll never forget.
And my husband worked a block and a half south of the World Trade Centers, and I was unable to reach him for hours. So my producer was trying to call him, and she was trying to call other people that we knew. I was giving her numbers, and yet at the same time doing my job.
The buildings collapsed, and as they collapsed, the New York Stock Exchange shook. I could see the doors coming down on the stock exchange. They had made the decision to literally seal the stock exchange because there was they felt it was too dangerous for anyone to be outside. It was that dark and difficult to breathe outside.
It looked like Pompeii. You know, everything was covered in ash. It was thick. It was white. It seemed to be inches and inches thick. The smell was strong, smoky, that really you could not escape from.
It looked like the biggest Arctic snowstorm you've ever seen in your life.
It looked like some sort of nuclear winter.
White all over the place, white dust and debris and things, and people running and leaving their shoes.
I ran out of my shoes. They were slip-on shoes. I was barefoot. I did not know what I was stepping on. I don't think there's any way you can possibly describe trying to outrun one of the World Trade Center towers. I was running so fast, I guess I collapsed, you know, I fell down, and I went headfirst and slammed into a concrete barricade, and at that point just covered my head and, you know, prayed.
Firefighters, emergency medical service, police were rushing towards this thing, and then when we learned later that these buildings collapsed on them, I went bananas. I said, good God. Not only could I have been there from earlier in the morning, we would have had a live shot from there, but I was heading toward this thing, and thank God for this cop to say, get out of here.
After both towers were down, I got caught in the massive evacuation, and there were thousands of people heading north on foot. And what I remember most about it was how silent it was, except for one woman. And I went up to her to see if she needed help, if she needed an ambulance, because she was crying. And she was able to tell me that her husband, who worked for the Port Authority, worked on the 68th floor of the North Tower, directly below where the first plane hit. And she heard from a coworker that he was alive. Well, before I could hand this woman a tissue, he appears looking like man from the moon.
You are covered from head to toe in white dust.
I haven't seen a mirror, but I guess so.
What is it? What is it? Oh, it's
just
the
dust.
building.
Just dust.
We on the ground.
When the building came down, I was right there, and everybody started running. And,
what makes that piece of tape so dramatic is that that is the emotional reunion that so many people wanted. that they never got.
We knew nothing. No one was talking to us. Finally, Ari Fleischer came back on the plane and said, "The president is moving. He's going to continue to keep moving, but we'll be landing shortly at an Air Force base. When we get there, you cannot report to your offices where we are until we give you the okay."
I didn't really know what was safe. There were a lot of rumors going around that day, and you sort of have to separate the fact from the fiction. And people say, well, as a reporter, you know, you were so out of touch on 9/11, the cell phones were down. And for me personally, I only reported what I could see and what people were telling me, the content in my interviews.
We heard that the State Department had a car bomb that had gone off, and I was standing right there, so I was able to say, no, I don't think so.
I got back in the car, drove about 30 seconds, and was finally at a place where I was able to see the Pentagon. There were fire engines, there were ambulances zooming by me, there were helicopters hovering over the Pentagon in itself, and of course there was huge amounts of smoke.
I was able to go over the median strip and up the wrong way of a ramp, and as I crested the ramp, I pulled up and the Pentagon was on fire right in front of me. It filled my windshield. I
was really afraid. I was afraid for my life. I was afraid of missing the action and covering it. I mean, I think we've all heard the stories of the reporters who weren't rolling their tape recorders when somebody was assassinated. So I remember the moment of going back to my car and turning on the recorder. Even though nothing was happening at that moment except all of the hubbub around the Pentagon, I wanted to be rolling.
It became technical. I was checking my battery, I was checking the exposure. I had to make sure my shots were still. Anything that may be happening is not going to happen again. So you have to gather all that and let the editors sort it out later on. They're not going to replay a building fire, so you have to get that quickly, and then you have to shoot the scene later for documentary purposes.
And we had to make sure to let people know, you know, this is a bad day, these are bad things happening, but it's not that bad. Let's all pull ourselves together. Let's just remember, let's stay focused. The only thing that's been hit that we know of is the Pentagon. That's the only place we see a lot of smoke. Just stay away from that area and go home. Just go home and hug your kids.
I didn't really think about my safety. I was just focused on doing my story, getting it on the air, reporting live. It didn't hit me until my day was done.
I heard an emergency workers two-way radio communicating about rescue efforts and where people were. And in the dark, literally could not see anything in front of my face, heard this, and I knew if I was going to have a fighting chance of seeing anybody again, my husband, my son, my family, if I was going to live, I had to get to where that radio was.
Eventually it got gray, you know, very dark gray outside, and I was able to at least see a light inside the doorway of this building.
The remarkable thing about all the emergency efforts down at Ground Zero is that so much took place in places that you would never expect at all. I was taken to a deli where they opened up the cages of you know, water and juice and whatever it was, and that's where all the firefighters and police officers were getting hosed down, getting oxygen.
The policeman was opening the door and coming out, and he let me in, and I was inside with 2 or 3 police officers and a handful of other people. Everybody was scrambling around. People were trying to use the phones and figure out what was going on, and none of us really knew exactly, you know, everything that had gone on. We were just in this building, and a woman suggested I wash off my face because I was covered in soot and ash, and I did that and came back out, and you know, my throat was filled with this stuff.
And there was a female police officer who I remember so distinctly who was hacking and hacking, and she had so much soot in her lungs, and she was just really trying to breathe, and she told me, she's like, do whatever you can, get that soot out of your mouth, get it out of your lungs, and she told me to cough, to sneeze, she said, vomit if you can.
This wasn't a war zone. This was my world. I had always thought of the world I lived in as being relatively safe. I know people are killed every day in car accidents or people are shot. I've covered stuff like that. But you don't think jets are going to be crashing all around you and that another jet may be on its way and that it could, you know, you could be dead.
It was a war scene. I mean, people were hacking and vomiting and on oxygen and getting doused with water, and I was just terrified.
When we landed at the first Air Force Base, we were told, don't tell anybody where you are, don't take pictures of anything that would reveal where you are, because they had to keep the president's location secret. They said even turning on our cell phone and calling our office would give somebody a way to trace our location. So we, of course, obeyed and got on board the base and were taken to a hallway of offices where the Air Force people would put us down at a secure telephone. Everything was, in the military, was, you know, very complicated. They had to dial numbers for us to get an outside line. I reached ABC, and because I was a pool correspondent, I was there representing all broadcasters. My first obligation was to call ABC News and say, this is where the president is, at least we can say he's at an Air Force base, and he's preparing to make a statement.
When we left there, what was most striking is many of the White House staff and press were jettisoned, some of the Secret Service, even some of the Air Force One crew, and just a skeleton group of us got back on this great, big, huge aircraft and headed off. We had no idea where.
I was interviewed by a number of people, and to go from being the guy that asks the questions to all of a sudden being the guy that gives the answers was kind of an odd position to be in as well. So this public information officer came up to me and started asking me if I'd help out and can I give him the information to give to the FBI. And it's still tough to talk. I mean, I just basically dissolved into tears there. He threw his arms around me and he hugged me, and he said, he goes, look, you're not a journalist today, you're an eyewitness. You've just watched something that's horrific, and it's okay to cry.
The amazing thing about being in the hospital, which is the next place you go to the disaster place, and then you go, because if you can't get close, you go to the hospital. They were expecting carloads of people to come into the hospital. This was the closest hospital to the area. You must be talking now five blocks away from the World Trade Center. They were all ready. They were ready with their triage. They were ready to accept, and no wounded came in. So you either died or you got out of there.
I was brought out to the street, which looked unworldly. Was on the ambulance with firefighters who were injured and EMS workers who were injured, and we took off. The doors closed, and we were going north to Bellevue Hospital.
There was a man on a stretcher that was smoking. His clothes had either been burned off or blown off. He was terribly burned. They had an IV running into his arm, and they were running him to the helicopter for probably the first medevac of the day.
I was on oxygen. I had IVs in my arms. They had already cut off all my clothes, so I was in hospital gowns, and I was still covered head to toe in dirt. And my hair was completely matted down. You could not tell that it was orange. It looked black.
All the bridges and tunnels were closed. I was in Midtown Manhattan. There was no way to get to New Jersey. The first thing was not to get home. I mean, I knew that I had to go work.
These attacks obviously were designed to maximize impact, not just in terms of loss of life and political terms, but in economic terms as well. At the very least, 1/3 of this nation's financial transactions are routed through New York. This will disrupt the economy in a way I assume we can't fully appreciate yet.
From the moment I got into the hospital until they let me make that phone call to my newsroom, I had asked to be, I wanted a phone. I wanted someone to get me a phone, get me on the phone. I wanted to call my station, tell them, first of all, that I'm alive, because they know they sent me there, and I knew they would be concerned about my well-being. Two, I wanted to do my job. I wanted to get on the air and report the news. I wanted to tell them what I saw and what I experienced.
Are you telling us you were buried underneath some of the rubble?
I didn't know whether or not there was a building on top of me and I had 2 inches of breathing room, or whether or not I would see the sky. It was the most horrendously nerve-wracking, scary 5 minutes I've ever experienced.
I was never really worried about my own safety, and in fact, I had such a different day than so many of my cohorts. You know, we were up in the air. For us, it was a silent experience.
Here we have 343 firefighters dead. All of these police officers dead. All of these, close to 3,000 people dead, and this nothing compares to it.
It was a beautiful golden sunset when we finally got back to Washington. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the president's helicopter set him down on the White House South Lawn. And I finally, for the first time, had the responsibilities off my shoulder. And I opened my laptop, And there across the top line was an email from our oldest son who's in college. And it said, "Mom, Ted Adderley, his fraternity brother, was on the 93rd floor of the first tower." And all of a sudden it hit me. This has a human face. It's somebody I know. It's a friend of my child's. It had a human face. And I sat down and I cried.
Took my breath away when I finally heard my husband's voice. And it was one of those things that I didn't even realize that how upset I was about it and how concerned I was about him until I heard his voice.
And I'd finally gotten through to my daughter, and I was on the phone with her, and she started to tell me, you know, my friends, Liz and Kristen, they haven't found their dads. They don't know where they are. They're afraid they're dead, because both of them worked at the Pentagon. And that's where you see the tentacles of this whole thing extending out.
I was out in the field, so I never saw what was going on in New York until that night. What I saw was all this smoke. And I knew that people had died. And I knew it was going to get a lot worse before it was going to get better.
Have I cried? No. Am I scared of what's going to happen next? Yeah. I hope I'm around to cover it and describe it, and I hope that you know, I hope that it doesn't happen again.
There's a certain reporter instinct that kind of takes over, where all you're really worried about is just trying to figure out, how do I report the story? It's so big. How do I get my hands around this thing? How do I get the words to be able to describe it?
The one thing that helped me that day is I had a job to do, and it kept me focused.
I guess a surgeon when he starts an emergency operation, or a policeman when he answers an emergency call, kicks into an automatic pilot. That's your professional calling.
It's only when I start thinking a little bit about the friends aren't there. 5 friends of mine died that were traitors that I knew.
I knew I was the only voice, the only broadcaster with the President of the United States. Not just for Americans, not just for the government, for the world, to know that the leader of the United States was safe, that he was in control, he was in touch, and that he was in command. You do it. You don't think about it.
Because of that detachment that we went through as reporters that day, there were no tears for weeks before I was able to finally let that go. And when I finally started getting emotional about it and letting it sort of affect me as a human, that was when I kind of had to turn my focus onto the things that I saw that day, the humanity, people helping each other out. People would pull their cars over on the side of the road, blast the radio so that other people could listen. Other people would pull their cars over on the side of the road and say, "Hey, we're going to Maryland, we're going to Virginia. Does anybody need a ride? Does anybody need a way out?"
It was a disruption the likes of which I've never seen in my life, where the economy, the entire economy, was halted, I mean entirely halted for 4 straight days. People did not leave their homes. No one got on a plane. They stayed home and watched television and did absolutely nothing else. At most, they might have ordered in dinner. No one did anything for 4 days. That's not happened in this country before, where the entire economy stopped.
There's so many things the world should remember about that day. I think one of them is just the bravery of so many people, whether they were the everyday people who were in the buildings helping each other out and helping each other escape, or the firefighters and the police officers and the Port Authority officers and all those people and all the rescue people who were there.
The fact that they got the exchange up in less than a week, and it was a 700-point down day, it was the busiest day in market history, and yet, despite the destruction that was in Lower Manhattan, they got the system working in less than a week, which in my mind is one of the most remarkable things that's ever happened in this type of environment.
It's remarkable to me how fast it came back. I mean, I could not believe it. I couldn't believe how fast the cleanup effort occurred, the rescue effort, the valiant efforts. I interviewed probably 40 or 50 firemen in those 4 days, and they came from all over the United States.
I think we're vulnerable. I think we will always be vulnerable. The other side of the coin is that this country, this city, is resilient, comes back, and we'll make it back.
And people recovered. The consumer never stopped spending once he or she was comfortable that that event had passed. We've had a very strong economic recovery in the wake of September 11th.
Unfortunately, it's easy to get out of America because we are free. You know, and they say freedom isn't cheap, and it's not. Freedom isn't free.
What can you learn from this? That life changes, that horrible things can happen, that people can go on, that even though threats remain, you try to live your life, you try to do the best you can.
I tell you this much, though, it really gave me a better perspective on my family and my children. You know, I say I love you a lot more than I used to.
I hope what people learn from 9/11 isn't what happened because of the terrorists. I hope what comes out of 9/11 is what happened in the aftermath. Not the events, but the aftermath. The courage, the commitment, the people who just rallied to the call, and I think the strength of America. I saw the strength of America, and I think that really helped me get through this. I mean, the days that followed, I've never been more proud to be an American than now, really.
My generation was never very patriotic. We never were flag wavers. I'm 46 years old. We never went, yeah, America. This event made our generation patriotic to a very large degree.
To me, the senselessness of it was the most striking thing. I mean, clearly there are people in the world who have no interest in dialogue, and also, I think, you know, misperceive the role of the United States in world affairs. I can't imagine that America's foreign policy is responsible for what happened on September 11th.
It could happen anywhere, anytime, and I think we all need to be more sensitive, I think, to what's going on in the world, and make sure that we understand why we are in the positions we're in and what can we do to prevent the things like have happened from ever happening again.
Just because somebody is a different race, religion, whatever, it doesn't mean everybody's like that. There's good and bad in everything.
For people overseas that look at us from as Americans, they need to understand that we're just people just like everybody else, and we hurt and bleed, and we don't want to feel these things either. You know what I mean? That these are just people.
It was unlike any news story in history where people were watching because they didn't know what was coming next. People were watching because they didn't know what happened to their loved ones.
We simply do not know who has been hurt and what casualties might have occurred, which is...
September 11th was journalism's most responsible day, and this was a day where there was no blueprint on how to report. This was a day like no other.